So now we've added the functionality for our read, which then returns us the type of observable donut array. We know this because we are explicitly typing via a generic type. So this then gets inferred to our type definition where we have this return the type of observable donut. So now we need to implement the ability in our app component to fetch the data for our single component. So go ahead and change this. We're then going to see a completely blank form because we don't have any data. So in a sense, we need to implement our read1 because at the moment all we have is a static read which reads our array find. And we commented this out because our .read is now returning an observable, which we cannot use things such as .find because that is not how observables work. We would need to first subscribe, get the data out, and then go and find it. Now we can actually merge this thinking inside of an observable stream, and I'm going to show you a really nice way that we can achieve this result. So inside of our donut single, we have this line which we commented out already. So if we go back and undo this, we can do something like this, change our read1 over to a new line, and then add a .subscribe. So what this is then going to allow us to do is get that individual donut and then bind it to this .donut. So if we save this out and go back to our donut service, we've now brought back our read1. So if we then save this out, this is then going to give us an error. Property find does not exist on type observable. That is because this .read is now returning an observable. So when our component loads, what we're essentially doing is initializing our read1. So we're saying, go and get me this single item. Now we could use an HTTP request and go and get that one item, but I think from a data standpoint, it makes sense for us in our application to just go and load all of the data and then go and pass back that individual item that we then want. So how do we do that? We're essentially going to provide this same logic. However, we now need to wrap it inside of an observable. And this is actually very easy. The only thing that we really need to change is this .read. So really, instead of this .read, we want to access our donuts, but we want it in the raw data form. So what we can do, let's jump up the top and say return this .read. So at this point, we are going to either grab the existing data. Remember, we essentially stored it inside of our service. So if the data is already loaded, for example, if we're on the home page and we click an item, the data is already loaded. So then when we read it, we're just going to get all of the items instantly back because the donut length just exists on our service. So it's at this point now, and this is a great way that we can then share a single observable source, whether it's our observable of or our GET request, and essentially branch off of it. Now to do this, we can provide a pipe, and then much like in JavaScript where we have an array map, we also have the same functionality in RxJS. So we can pass in a map function. Now if you hit enter, this is then going to import it from our RxJS package. We can then go back down. So when we map over the items, we're going to get given all of those donuts. So inside of our callback is for us to then implement our find. If we do find the donut, we want to return it. Otherwise, we're going to return our empty object. And that's almost all we need to do. So let's grab this, drag it up, and we can save things out. Things get reformatted nicely. And that's almost all we need to do. So what's happening here is we are either way, whether we have an ID or not is irrelevant. We're making a read and then we're piping off of it. So all of this logic is going to happen. We don't care about it anymore. We are simply using our read1 and reusing our other methods. So we're reading our data. We get given the data in the same way that our list subscribe gets the data. And then we just simply moved our logic up. So here we're accessing the raw data. It's not an observable. You can see here that we have a donut array. We can then move our code. We have donut.find. I want to find the item. Now, if that is then returned, we then return the donut from our map. So what happens is our donut is then returned. The observable is then returned. And then our subscribe is then called. And the donut that we then found is passed through our subscribe. which we then bind in our component. So this is super nice and clean. We could, for example, go into our database, go and grab another ID. We'll take our glazed fudge, change out our read one. We can hit save and you can see nothing. And then because we're waiting 1 second, our data then appears. Now, because we are waiting 1 second, we actually have a console error. Cannot read properties of undefined, reading.name. Now, this is because if we jump into our donut form, we have donut name being used straight up. Now, we could do what we did in the previous lesson, and we could add a question mark. So, for example, we could do this, and then we can see it moves on to the next item, which is donut.icon, and we could do this all the way down. However, I don't kind of like this approach because if we refresh, we see a blank form, and then our data appears. So, from a user experience perspective, it feels a bit strange. So what we could do is bind an ngIf statement and supply an else fallback. So we could say ngIf equals, if we have a donut, then we want to render it. Else we can say loading. Now we need to now go and create a template piece to hold our loading indicator, or at least our loading text. So underneath, we're going to create ng-template, and inside simply say loading ... And of course, now we need to add hash loading for our template reference variable. We can then save this out. We then see loading, and then our form gets loaded when our data becomes available. Again, we can give it a refresh. We see loading, and this feels far nicer for the user. So with this in mind, we're pretty much done for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed this one. This is really nice and it demonstrates how easy it is to create an observable. Angular's HTTP gives us an observable. We then check if our data is already loaded, if we're going to read it again, or if in our read one, our data is loaded, it just gives it straight to us. We can then grab that raw data, we go and find the item, we can then return it if it exists. Otherwise, we return an empty object definition. So with this in mind, let's jump into the next lesson where we're going to continue building out our service. We've got creation events, we've got update and delete. And as we progress, we're then going to start hiding some of these form fields based on whether we are creating a new item or editing an existing one.